Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Rando, and I'll be preaching on Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 5. Evil and injustice. I'm sure we all have a bunch of stories or things that come to mind when we think of those words, evil and injustice. It's when you turn on the news and right away you see stories of war. You see stories of like COVID-19 cases all over, people dying. You see invasion in Ukraine, monkeypox. You have all different kinds of injustices and evils that happen on a daily basis, moment by moment. It's those things that you look and say, that's not the way life's supposed to be. It's those things that make us cry out, make us, all of us as humanity, say something's wrong. Something is wrong in this world. And that's the question that we're going to be faced with today is, how do we live and what do we do in the midst of evil and injustice? And here's the argument that I'm going to make and that we see in the passage. Faithfully wait. He won't be late. So when we go to Habakkuk chapter 2, we see in the book of Habakkuk, just to let you know as a quick background, Habakkuk is in a time period in Judah where Josiah had just died, an evil king, Jehoiakim, is on the throne, and there's injustice and evil everywhere. And Habakkuk is crying out to God, how long do I have to wait till you bring justice here? Now God responds by saying, he already has a plan. He's already been thinking about this. And his plan is to bring a different nation, the Babylonians, to Judah. And that's how he's going to judge Judah. Now Habakkuk, he has some problems with this. And he says, God, how do you use these wicked people to judge Judah, who's more righteous than they are? How do you do that? And Habakkuk says he's sitting on his watch post and waiting to hear God's response to his argument. And that's where we are in chapter 2, verses 2 to 5. So starting in verse 2. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. So the first thing that we see when it comes to how do we live in the midst of evil and injustice is the first thing is communicate what God said. Communicate what God said. So it's almost like write the vision, make it plain. Make it plain, it's like a documentation. It's like a legal term. Make it plain, we might think like write it neatly. No, this is not the point. It's a legal term. Document it, authorize it, make it official. So this writing, it's almost like you ever listen to somebody say something? I heard somebody recently say, Jesus said, know thyself. Sure that was Jesus, or wasn't that Socrates? But anyway, you've ever heard or read a book that has said, oh yeah, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. But where's the proof? How do you know that that person said that? And it's not until you receive some sort of official document, something that's signed. Sometimes like in the New Testament, Paul says, I write this with my own hand. Like there's something that authorizes this is the person who said this. And God is telling the same thing to Habakkuk. He says, write it down, document it, take note, quote me on this. And so we, in the same way, quote God on what he has said. Quote God on what he has said in his word, that he is going to bring justice to the world. He's going to right wrongs and bring justice to the earth. So we communicate what God has said. And so he may run who reads it. So we document, we take note, we communicate what God has said. So he may run who reads it. This run, you might think of like fleeing, running away. That's not the meaning of this word. To run is a figurative word for messengers who would run and go and share the message. So we have this writing, this documentation for the purpose that people would spread the news. And we need to hear this. We need to hear the hope. In the midst of evil and injustice, it's hard to be overwhelmed by the evil and injustice. We need to remind ourselves of the hope. We need to remind ourselves that God is going to come, and he's going to bring justice to the earth, and he's going to right wrongs. So the first thing we do when we're in the midst of evil and injustice, how do we live? We communicate what God has said, number one. But in the midst of communicating, we recognize that the fulfillment is not here, and we have to wait. So the second thing we do in the midst of evil and injustice is we wait, even though it seems to delay. Verse 3, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. The appointed time, the visions for an appointed time. This word appointed time is like the feast days. God established the feast days. They're for appointed times. Like Ecclesiastes, there's an appointed time for this, an appointed time for that. God establishes the times. That our times are in God's hands. And this delay, it's like, in one sense, if it seems slow, or really if it delays, is a proper translation. If it delays, wait for it, it will surely come. It will not delay. So you have two similar Hebrew words that don't seem to have any kind of difference. As a matter of fact, one scholar had mentioned, he said, maybe there was some sort of nuance difference at some point, but we just don't know what that was. So it just seems likely that we translate it the same way. If it delays, ... it will not delay. What exactly is this? It's like a paradoxical nature of time. In one sense, things subjectively feel like they're delaying. In another sense, objectively, they're not delaying. You remember being a kid and just wanting to be an adult so bad. When will I be able to drive? And when will I be able to get a car? And when can I pay bills? When can I be like an adult? And then all of a sudden, you blink twice, and here we are. It's like, where did that time go? How did we get here so fast? Isn't that funny? In the time, it feels like it's taking so long. But then when it comes, you look back and you say, oh my goodness, time just flew by. And that's exactly what's going to happen with us. Right now we groan. Right now we see all the wickedness and evil and injustice in the world. We see things that make us say, like, cringe and say, God, that is not the way life should be. Why is it taking so long? When will you bring justice to the earth? When will you right wrongs? And yet we know that at some point we will look back, blink twice, and look back and say, wow, time just flew by. And here we are, where wrongs have been made right, and injustice is no more. So, in one sense, we communicate what God has done. The second, we wait, even though it seems to delay, remembering it will surely come. But what do we do in the midst of this waiting? What do we do in this time period where we're waiting and we're communicating and reminding ourselves of what God has said? Well, as we continue looking in this passage, the third thing that we do is we live faithfully in the midst of evil and injustice. Let's look at verse 4 and 5. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. In one sense, of course, if we continue reading in Habakkuk, this is talking about the Babylonians, as God in chapter 2 continues it. Woe, 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 woe to the Babylonians. Judgment is coming. But in another sense, in verse 4, there's a lack of a subject. In other words, it's like he's talking about just he. Who's he? Well, it doesn't specify. And I think that that's very much purposeful. And the reason is because Habakkuk comes to God and he says, well, there's the wicked Babylonians and the more righteous Judeans. And God is saying, it's not Babylonians and the Judeans, it's the arrogant, the ones who are not upright. And it's the people who are righteous and live faithfully. That's the distinction. That's the two different people. And so you could be a Judean and be on either side. You could be a Babylonian and be on either side. And so in that sense, it's something that ministers in one sense about the judgment of the Babylonians. But in another sense, it warns about just the judgment in general of those who are arrogant. And it tells us how to wait. We wait faithfully. The righteous wait faithfully. The arrogant are not upright. And as we see, they act in a greedy way. So this word is puffed up in verse 4. The arrogant, puffed up, or the presumptuous. This word actually only occurs one other time in the Hebrew Bible. Most scholars actually will look at this word, upla, and they will say, no, maybe the two letters are switched, or maybe you have to separate the word, even though there's no textual evidence for this. Instead, I think it's better to just go with what the Hebrew text says, and I think that it's very purposeful. It points us to a story in Numbers 14. If you go back and read through Numbers 14, it's the time when the spies go into the Promised Land to seek out the Promised Land. And when they come back with a negative report, all the people believe, like, hey, we shouldn't go into the Promised Land. So God tells people, you won't enter the Promised Land. Cut off. You're not going to be able to enter, except for Joshua and Caleb. Well, when Moses tells the people what God had just said, the people respond by saying, you know what? We're going to go up and we're going to fight to get into the Promised Land. Now, Moses cautions against this, but they presumptuously, in a puffed up way, they arrogantly go up into battle. And the battle ends in a horrible way. But the point is that they had an option, either to just submit to what God had said would happen and faithfully wait, or take matters into their own hands. And that's kind of that desire, this greed that it talks about, this kind of person that's like never at rest, the nomad that travels around looking for a home but never finds one. That's what it's like for those of us who decide to take things into our own hands. We try to grasp at justice. We try to bring justice into the world through our own hands, by our own means, not trusting in the Lord, not going through the proper channels. And when we do that, we end up with nothing. We don't succeed. There was a story for me that really, God really ministered to me through this story. And I was living in an apartment complex, and one of my neighbors was a drug dealer. We were doing a children's ministry, and I saw a bunch of teenagers going in and out of that apartment. And I was like, man, can you believe this? We're here trying to preach the gospel and share the gospel with the teenagers, and here's this guy right across the hall, like having a place where these teens could go in and get high and spend time. Like, man, and this guy's like I was just like, man, you're taking advantage of these kids, and that's not right. And I was just so mad, and felt like this was righteous anger. And I was venting to my roommate. I'm like, you know what, man? I'm just going to go over there. I'm going to let him know, put him in his place. Like, as if through intimidation, I'm going to have him stop selling weed to the teenagers in the name of righteous anger. As I'm talking to my roommate about this, I get a knock at the door. And it was this little girl, 8 years old, who lived in that same apartment as this drug dealer. And she says, hey, Mr. Anthony, and she gives me a piece of paper. And then the note on the piece of paper said, thank you so much for talking to me about God. When you talk to me about God, it makes me happy. And man, I just remember thinking in that moment, like, wow, Lord, like, when there's evil and injustice, I want to take things into my own hands. And I'm not even looking for you. I'm so overwhelmed by the evil, by the injustice, so wrapped up in my own anger and how I'm going to fix this, that I miss you. I completely miss what you're doing in the midst of all this. And that's what happens. When we try to take matters into our own hands, we set our eyes off of God and what he's doing. And so a part of living faithfully is our submission to God and deciding to live faithfully by trusting the Lord, even in the midst of evil and injustice. So it's this greed, this strong appetite versus a quiet trust. And if we remember, the righteous shall live by faith is quoted in Romans 1, Galatians 3, and Hebrews 10. Faith is the basis of our relationship with God. Faith, our trust, our commitment to walk with God, even when things look bleak, even in the midst of evil and injustice. So we've seen, what do we do in the midst of evil and injustice? Well, on one hand, we communicate what God had said. Number two, we wait, even though it seems a delay. And number three, we live faithfully, not taking things into our own hands, but trusting in the Lord. At the end of chapter 2, it ends with this scripture. It contrasts idols with the Lord, and it says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him." And you know, that picture, that hushing before the Lord, it's kind of just draws up this picture of us all being in like a courtroom. And in the courtroom, we're all angry, we're upset, it's a loud environment. We're all, where is justice? When will this injustice be over? And we're shouting our arguments of why this needs to happen and that needs to happen, and how wrong things are. But the judge is absent. And finally, we see the door swing open and the judge walk in the door, and the whole courtroom, silence before him as he rights wrongs, as he brings justice. And that same thing will happen one day, that we'll be here all on earth, looking around at the evil and injustice, and how long? When will this end? How long do these things that just seem wrong, they're not right, they shouldn't happen? How long? And as we all, as humanity, are crying out like this, one day we'll see the great judge of all the earth enter into our atmosphere in the clouds, where all the entire world will see him. And all of us together, as we watch the judge of all the earth right wrongs and bring justice to the earth. And all the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Faithfully wait. He won't be late. Thank you.